If I was to say that that maybe games are a social, cultural phenomenon, what frames of reference would that give you for where we're going with my presentation, if we can get to the start? I ask that because in one of my questions to somebody, I talked about Vygotskian perspectives versus the Piagetian perspective. And I think that's, that social cultural perspective on games, I think is quite interesting. And then if you look towards Vygotskian's work from the mastery side of things and what the potential is of games, I think that's a nice exploration to go down, and that's where I've been going down. And you mentioned my PhD, that's part of that, you know, that inquiry, if you like. And the phenomenology side of things with Merleau-Ponty, I think is very interesting as well from the game perspective. So we move forward. And the first thing I'm sure everybody in the room would like to do would say thanks so much to the team. You know, we see up front who you are, and behind the scenes there's also people. I think it's been a super conference. I honestly didn't know much about the conference before, and I think it's a super conference. I've had lovely days here. Hospitality's been above anything. It's been super. The people I've met, the presentations, it's been really good. So you guys who put it together, thank you so much. I have a simple and humble presentation because you had your gala dinner last night, which was very nice. So I thought I'd try and keep it simple and humble, and that's why I gave you the illusion to try and get your eyes going a bit at the start in case they were a bit red from the drinks and the free vouchers drinks we had last night. Okay, so I'm from Denmark, and you get an introduction to my, here we go, into my labs. I got some examples of it, and student work. I sort of changed over the years in so much as trying to make the system, to make the impact towards trying to get the next generation to support them to go out into the world and do their thing. So we have some good companies where I show you some examples of who am I. You probably haven't heard of me before, so I give a little bit of my background, and as you can see, there's a little moral. So we're going down a little storyline as we do. But first, where we are, I'm working in Denmark, and as you can see, we've got 3 campuses, one up north, the main campus in Aalborg. Then there's Copenhagen, you've heard of course, and the southwest corner is Esbjerg, and that's where my lab is based. It's called the Sensorama Lab. I founded it around about 2004. And it's quite nice. We have a nice big screen side this wall and different things going on. We do lots with trying to see how we affect people. We went for passive stereo VR because a lot of the work I do is within disability, and so we didn't want to put shutter glasses on them and what have you, but I come to one of the examples where I talk about that. And then I think this is for Carlos, if he's in the room. Carlos asked me about CIGAR. He'd heard about the games center, the new games center we have up there, and I'll try and push it in a bit, but I'm sure you can do a bit of improvising and read the text. And please, please, please get in touch with Henrik if you're interested. Befriend or whatever you do these days. I'm not a great social mediaist. I got a 2-meter wall around my house and go behind that and sort of lock it, and I'm very quiet in there. But I do arrange conferences. That's why I realized the hard work that's gone into this conference. And over the years, I've been lucky in so much as there's the ICAT up there where I was on the board, and then these Arts IT and interaction and game creation, and ICDV-RAT, which was disability, virtual reality, and associated technologies. And those are always great because I do those to try and get students to publish, my students to publish locally without all the costs involved of going abroad. So typically with our lab, we have this big 5-meter by 2-meter screen, and this was an example of a magic carpet that was virtually stood on it, and the guys did this camera tracking to make you fly around a 3D model of Beijing. Games and student projects where they make, this was a master project, and later I show you the company that evolved from these guys. what we're doing now is, we had a little chat just now, is what's the state of the lab. And in Denmark, things have changed in so much as the humanities are suffering a bit. And our education is actually closing down in the campus where I am, and the lab's closing down. So we're going very mobile towards the HMDs. And I was quite curious about trying to get information from people inside the HMDs. So we've got the Rifts, and you can put on this apparatus. It's made in London, the brain activity device up the top left. There's a new device where they've got it's a 3D printed glass, 3D printed glasses where you put a world camera on top and a pupil dilation camera underneath, and they've got plugins that go inside the Rift. So that's quite interesting to get that information of what you're looking at within the virtual environment, how that affects you within the virtual environment, and how to do your iterative design around what your analysis are. So I've got 3 companies that come out as spin-outs from the education. I'm going to give you a little quick introduction to them. I hope this is going to work now. Are they both working there? Yeah, so these guys are called Virtual Lab. Finished about 2005 as master students with us. And it's a win-win for us because we go out there with projects. They take our internships, so they get some guys going in there. And the profile of Esbjerg is lots and lots of offshore. They build in the big offshore rigs within the harbour, and everything that goes with that supply out to them. And we've also got then the wind farms. So Siemens, Vestas are down the harbour. And you've got lots of things in maintenance, and so the guys are working with HMDs so they can do some maintenance remotely. On the helicopter you see over there, they use the Connect to train people how to land the helicopter. They've also got safety training.
When a critical situation occurs.
And they're also working with the rehab side of things as well.
And skills, which is not possible with traditional e-learning and literature.
So doing really, really well.
Leads to major cost savings.
I just jumped forward. Another company working with augmented reality, much more than the more virtual reality, for example, is called Intertisement. They've done around the world projects. One guy is the programmer, the other guy can talk, and he's very, very creative. And then they get interns from us as well to supplement what's needed within their team. So again, we're very proud of them, Intertisement. And then you might have heard of these because these guys are based in Copenhagen.
iMotions is software for better and faster human behavior research. Every day, thousands of researchers in the academic and commercial worlds try to better understand how human emotions drive how we act, think, and feel. Research that's being used to help diagnose global diseases, improve training and learning, build better products, and help companies connect better with users and consumers. Biosensors like eye tracking, facial expression analysis, EEG, galvanic skin response, and heart rate help measure actual human emotions. However, no sensors or stimuli are connected, and several software tools are needed to get it all to work. It's difficult, time-consuming, and leaves room for manual errors. Researchers spend most of their time getting good data sets rather than working on what really matters, analyzing results and making groundbreaking innovations. That is why we built iMotions, the first true biometric research platform. iMotions allows researchers to connect all these different biometric devices and synchronize and live visualize all data streams automatically in one easy-to-use software platform. With iMotions, you don't need to piece things together. Out of the box, iMotions supports more than 50 leading biosensors and eye trackers. iMotions is the one-stop shop, whether it's a single study or a multidisciplinary lab with many data collection points and mass production of behavioral data. iMotions is being used by world-leading academic and commercial research institutions, all using iMotions to take their human behavior research to the next level. With iMotions, researchers execute research faster, increase validity and reliability, and spend more time concluding rather than plumbing. Learn today how iMotions can elevate your research.
So the thing to do is count how many times he says "I motions," huh? So, but it's probably the biggest spin out that we've had, and they're pretty global. So you may have heard about them. So, who is Tony Brooks? So I'm going to give you a little bit of secret now in these next couple of slides, because, yeah. So, I was born into a musical family. My father played drums and he played trombone. He's one of these guys who could virtually play everything but a stringed instrument. So what I decided I would do was I would play a stringed instrument. And I was really into experimental, and this is what's called a MIDI bass, in so much as you have electric wires inside the neck that that replicate outside the neck, that give digital information, MIDI information, from the bass guitar, and you can map that into sounds, into visuals, into anything, just about. And this was from 1985, so quite a long time ago. And the big picture there was an installation where I was playing a hydraulically driven sculpture from the bass, which was quite interesting, standing in front of it with all these metal plates crashing around you. And then we had some dancers as well. So I didn't put the pictures of the dancers in them. They weren't wearing many clothes, but it was really quite crazy, abstract, but lots and lots of fun. Oh yeah, I made a CD with a Korean monk who was a master musician, who was superb. Did lots of work in Korea, so if there's any Koreans here, 안녕하세요, which means I think hello. And I'm a scuba diver, so I hope some of this will relate to the where I go with my research. And this was down in Australia, where I presented my work for the Sydney 2000 Olympics and Paralympics. And I just went up north to Cairns and went out on the reef. And it probably influenced me with the design of this game that I tell you about afterwards, where we worked very much with the brain injured, where we had two sensors tracking a wire mesh 3D dolphin catching fish as they come down. And I explained a bit more about this, but this was in Comdex in Basel, presenting it. And in the next slide, you will probably see that I try to play golf. And I find golf very interesting because of the movement I'm interested in with people. My work, I did a very early gesture control system before some of them, the end of the 90s. And I quite like I like to think there's a relationship between the thinking of movement in golf, where you think you're in a certain position, but you're not in a certain position, how you feel relative to where you actually are. I quite like writing. I've got some books. The one on the left, the red one's out there. The other one's coming out next year. And we've got the second volume of this one over here coming out now. So my PhD, we looked at something called ludic engagement designs for all. And what I target is fun, which is sometimes a tough research subject to sell. But I created this thing called the Virtual Interactive Space, the VIS, which was presented to the physiotherapists in Yokohama for the World Conference for Physical Therapy. It's always quite a challenge sometimes because my profile is very strange. It's on the cusp of many things, as I guess you're getting. Because I'm not a hardcore gamer. I use games. The art side has been informing of me in relation to the people I work with. And I'm not a therapist, I work with therapists. And my history and background, very similar to someone else in this room who'll know what that means, that's the red dragon from Wales. There you go, there you go. I expected an oogie then. But down the bottom you see, I was born into a family with disability, and I had one uncle that was profoundly disabled. In those days, don't hang me now on the political correctness, because each country seems to have its own PC. He was very, very, very disabled, and in the old days, spastic was the word that was used. Nowadays, it's more profoundly cerebral palsy. He couldn't do hardly anything, and we used to look after him, wash him, what have you. And then my other uncle had diabetes. He went blind, lost a limb, lost another limb, so wasted away. So I think there's a tacit knowledge from those days that has rolled over in my work. And what I did when I was very young, because I was doing music very young, I tried to find a way for my cerebral palsy uncle to express himself in a way, because he couldn't do anything. And in those days, we had this type of thing, an expression pedal, where you had a signal going into it, and you adjusted the pedal by putting your rolling your foot on it. And instead of using his foot, I put it under his elbows, so he was able to change his body weight, which he could do, and he could adjust then the volume or some part of the signal to affect the stimulus coming back to him. So, and that was okay, and then my life went on. And then I found out that I was really, really interested in this. I did a engineering degree, didn't really get into that. It was, and then this hung with me to such a point that I was doing my music, getting bored with that. I wanted to experiment much more. And so I decided to go into this and look at different avenues of research. So I'd spent all my money. I went to Stanford and met Max Matthews, went up to the Veterans Hospital and met a guy called David Jaffa, looking at some real state-of-the-art stuff in this field, and it was really, really interesting. There's also a company over there called Biomuse, who were working with the biofeedback side of things. Then in my research, I found out they were using this biofeedback within art, in so much as you know, everything's data, everything's information. Even if you're moving in space, that's information you can map. So they were using it in art. And what interested me then was to use this within the rehabilitation side of things I was interested in. But what I found through that, through doing lots and lots of field work, when I would prep someone up and put sensors on them, they'd usually fall asleep, or they didn't want it on their bodies. And then it was, you really wanted to move beyond that towards something else. The best system I found when I was over in California, I visited a guy called Jonathan Purcell who made this, and this was the Wave Rider. And what was so good about this is that you had the different channels of the biosignals coming out, but it was coming out as MIDI. So I can map that in the same way that I understood MIDI as musical instrument digital interface. So I understood that from my art side. And but these systems, I was the guy doing the facilitating, the intervention in the sessions with the patient or whoever was involved. And then every time I tried to go beyond that and involve people, technophobia was involved. People were so afraid of it. Nowadays you have the games, you know, the children are playing the games, so you have an association. But in those days you didn't have it. And some of the people I was trying to explain it to, they were afraid to hit a play button on a cassette player. So you can see it's a long time ago. So the research went, and because it was looking at movement, Laban's work is very informing in so much as he tried to do a Laban notation for documenting different types of movement, because within this work it's very hard to evaluate it. So I tried to find what movement analysis and classification, if you like, was being done. Laban's also got within his work effort, and so when you look at someone within rehabilitation, there is effort involved if they're physically disabled. And so the kinesphere is something we all have, and this is the space that we carry with us. When I walk over here, I carry my kinesphere, and it's as far as I can reach. And going into this and exploring this was a long time before what we have now with the Kinect and the other things. And I used to create these different spaces, and we were discussing just now, who do you work with? And I very much targeted the most marginalized, the people who really, really had big problems. And now I'm looking at locked-in people, just asking, well, what can they do? How can I get data from that person to be able to put it into a system to feedback, to stimulate them in a way to do something else? And can we then work with the team towards giving them something that's going on that can give them benefit? So for example, the bottom image down the bottom was a workshop I did, making some different creative spaces. The woman who's kicking her leg at, that's her son beside her, we had a space, it's a volumetric infrared sensor I worked with, about this high, and it was supposed to, you go into it with your body and move your hands. But she found the space, she was triggering like an organ, and then she decided to kick her leg in it to show that she could kick her leg. And in this place, they're profoundly multiple learning disabled. So there's a mental situation that they have. And the guy in the front with that little hat on, he would be crashing his head against the wall typically, but he found a space with a Jimi Hendrix guitar, and he just went absolutely nuts playing air guitar, and you can just see the smile on his face. The guy in the multiple picture over there, I have total permission to say all their names and to show you these pictures, the parents and everybody. So over there, this is Jonas. And with Jonas, I was asked by a music therapist to try and work with him because he had friends who played in a blues band who were more able than him. With Jonas, they asked me, could I get his cheek muscle, which was what he could control. It was at that time too tough to try and get that sensitivity. So we just say, okay, let's not work with the total control that he has, let's just see what he can do. And he could move his head, and he was another one that really loved this Jimi Hendrix. When he moved his head, he was influencing his carer who would stand on a chair, and she would play air guitar. And the end of the session was absolutely so much fun. So, alongside all this, I started then thinking, well, the stimulus of sound is okay, but we need to look at the stimulus and other stimulus, because not everyone's the same. And I did some work, and I was told very politely by a guy who was an artist, he said, music does nothing for me. I don't like it. So what you're doing is very nice, because we were doing some sessions, he was brain injured, and he said, I'm a visual artist. He brought me in a present, it was a catalogue of his work, and so I started working much more then with the visual side of things, very blobby, very, doing some animations as well and triggering that, and I can show you a little video afterwards, but not many people were looking at this, and there was some software coming along like that made sense to be able to map the MIDI to it. And so then the sensors that I was getting the data from the people with, there was restrictions when you work with one profile of a sensor, because I was working with the 3D volumetric infrared, but that wasn't sufficient. I also wanted to work with straight lines to confine someone as well to a certain movement. So I would then work with these different types. I'd work with the volumetric on the right-hand side, it's just a representation of the top. The planar, the camera, so what's opposite them, the patient, and then the linear side of things. So the ultrasound was the linear camera you note on the bottom, infrared. So these were my early sensors, where the one on the left, or the middle, if you like, this one up here, this was an old light. I took out the lights and put infrared sensors in them. And I had my mate, who was much better at electronics than me, jam with me, and we sparred, and then we improved stuff. And there were flexible necks on them, so you could position the sensor space just about anywhere you wanted, which was very nice. But the limitation, is always a limitation with them, was that the sensing space was about a meter or a meter and a half. And then I did some experiments, and I found out you could reflect off bike, the bike reflectors you have on the wheels. That would increase the length of the infrared capture zone. So I did some research on the reflection side of things, and there's the 3M did a reflection material, but what the police use and what they use on the signs of harbours when it's foggy is called retroreflexive prism technology. And this increased the sensing space up to 14 meters. You could have a 14-meter invisible space to capture data, and you could also cross-hatch this to have that as a very, very intense, high-resolution space in the middle, which was really, really interesting. So the human is always in the center, and there's different ways of capturing the information. Because as well as working with the information that you generate, it's also very interesting to work with silence, when the person can control not making things happen, or going to a point within a space to make something happen and not go beyond that. Do you understand what I'm saying? So can you control to that level, and you could change the different sensitivity of the data, of the content within each of the spaces. So each person you would tailor the environment to. I mentioned cross-hatching, and that was really, really important, how you could The infrared was very, very interesting because you didn't have any noise, you didn't have any problems like you do with ultrasound, where you have bounce back and you have to be very, very careful. With the camera side of things, with the light, you know, the limitations. Infrared was very, very nice. So, also how you worked with the big spaces was interesting. Whether you stood in the middle of this space and you went to the null position and totally blocked the light and moved your body to let the light come past you, or open up the light spaces to let so you could really, really improvise. But again, it was very hard to get the facilitators to understand unless they got dirty, unless they were the person that they wanted to work with. And I used to show the work in messes, big messes, and I'd be on the stand working with some other people, and for example, 2 therapists would come up and you'd hear them talking, and they would role play of a person they knew who had restrictive movement. Looking around from the research, what's happening within the pattern side of things about the different senses, very, very interesting. And then working within different contexts of mapping movement to different types of visual feedback. Like I said, we showed it at the Olympics in 2000. We also showed it in 96 with IBM sponsorship. You can see 3 senses. The reason for the 3 senses, you can map that either to 3 different musical instruments, or obviously within the animation side of things, you can map it to RGB. So you could paint any color. Huh? We also worked with video feedback and RGB of lights. So, which isn't really RGB, but the painting lights with robotic lights. Started off with just the colors, but then robotics, so the physical movement. Okay. Do I speak fast? Okay, good. So then I had to try and contextualize this and think, okay, simplistically, how is this? And when the people used to come into the spaces, very often, like I said, to prep that person within that space, they would fall asleep because they were so profoundly disabled. So then my friend, who is also a therapist, he would role play within that space and working on asking questions about what's going on, what is that experience for that person in that space, what do they experience. And so I put some of these images together saying, okay, this is the baseline of what they're experiencing, but behind that, what have you got? So a lot of the things you had to do is this evaluation side of things. Because you're capturing data and mapping the data, you can of course put that into an archive to analyze that data, to look at how that person can move more, move quicker, these types of things. So when I was looking at what's happened to me so far, it was very much towards this therapy side, this art side, and then I had to formulate a methodology towards how am I going to look at this? And action research was where you're within a situation and you're trying to make a difference within that situation. But that wasn't enough, and I needed to do interpretation. And hermeneutics is a body of work that usually looks at text like the Bible. So I choose to look at that, and could I change that a bit and use that to do an interpretation of the spaces I was creating and the data that I was looking at and the thinking that I had. So I synthesized action research with hermeneutics to get the methodology that I wanted, and it fitted really, really well. The PhD goes into much more detail about it. But it's very much about empowerment, that agency that you give that person. And instead of this intersubject situations that you create as the person and the content, where you're able to move or however input to a situation where you're getting a stimulus back, as well as the intersubjective, you've got the intrasubjective. What's happening within that person and what power that you have when you have that content that you can change as an artist, as a programmer in that situation. So very simply, you can see how it's evolving, I hope. But like I said, I'm not a therapist, so I needed some expert advice on this. We had a medical team to tell us what did they want from that. They would give us a profile of the person, and then they would tell us specifically what they wanted from each session. So we would have a treatment of program. I would then create, for example, 5 presets. So when I was in a session, I could keep a very close contact with that person. You need to have an eye contact, and I am in this space with this person, a sense. And you could very easily then step through each increment, so you were challenging that person each step, and often making mistakes, often going too early, but trying to find that moment when they're going out of the flow situation and you need to get them back into it. And what do you do? How long do you stay with them in that situation, and the changes you're able to make in that situation? And that's what the zoom is, and that's what I'd written in the paper, so you can read a little bit about it there. So to give you, so the picture you see down there is a guy who's a young guy with brain damage. And we'd gone into games by now. You're talking about the end of the 90s, so we're looking at Flash, very basic stuff. But what we did, for example, with this guy is, as he moved in front of the sensors, you have a waiter's tray hand and the glass, and we had different coefficients of friction on the tray and a different size. So as he moved, his task was given to him: how close can you get the glass to go to the edge without it falling off, which meant a dynamic movement back from the extreme of his right and the extreme of his left. This was the action research strategy I was looking at. So very much about the pre-planning, the action, the observation, reflection, then going through the cycle again and again. Now then, I was over in Copenhagen between 96 and about 2002, and I was staying at a friend of mine who was a surrogate mother of, she's still alive now but quite old, a surrogate mother of a guy who's a medical professor, ex-Harvard, working at Rochester University Hospital. He was visiting, and she said, "Tell Fred what you're doing." Because I didn't really know what I was doing. I was just going from step to step to step to try and learn what was going on. And he said to me, "What you're doing is this afferent neural feedback loop you're able to create. It's very similar to this causal feedback loop." And he put it into words and drew it out for me. And that's been a core since about 2001. And I wrote about it, a paper then about it. And I really think he was right on the button with it. Another instance that happened to me, I presented, if any of you know Roy Ascott, he's a pretty luminary artist guy. And he had a conference down in Beijing, and I was presenting down there. And I presented, and just after me, this lady presented. It was a super presentation, or the other way, it was the other way around. She presented and I presented. And then this guy came up to me and said, "We'd like you to join us for lunch." So of course I said yes. And he was a neurologist. And I'd explained to them something I was doing as well, which I didn't know how to put a word on it. And what that was, to give you an example, was if I'm going for, let's say this bottle. Yeah, here we go. So I'm going for this bottle, and I'm able to go for this bottle and look at that bottle. Now, if I look at you, I'm still able to go for that bottle. I have a memory within my muscle. Huh? So what I was doing was I was creating these invisible spaces. I'd have a point in space where a person could go into that point and create a sound. They would go back there, back there, back there, and learn that motion. Now, one of my presets would be to move that point just a small amount further away. And you could see them go in there, and we have this automatic mechanism within the body that we go into a search mode, and there it is again. You understand? So, and I do it again and again. So what was happening then is this person, the expanse of reach, not this big, but let's say bump, 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 bump. By the end, they're automatically reaching out to this point without thinking that they moved from this point. You understand? So it was called reafferentation. And I've only found one person who wrote about it, a guy called Hugh Ackerman. It's very interesting, these mechanisms within the bodies that we have. Now, during the presentations I've seen this week, some people have mentioned about when you play a game, you're moving with it. You're going into it. And I find it so interesting to look at that as an aspect of trying to stimulate someone to do that towards helping them within their physical ailments. So this is the reafferentation side of things, trying to explain very simplistic this. The evaluation side, of course, very much needed experts to come in, see what was going on. We were getting the quantifiable data, but also a lot of the qualitative side of things for the just eye contact, concentration, these aspects, and again, written up in the PhD. So, yeah. So I've got some examples now, and this one is a little bit heavy, and I'll cut a little bit because it goes on a little bit, but it's quite a strong one. I'll turn the volume down a little bit because what I used to do is I used to do these workshops, and I'd go for a weekend to a big institute, and there's lots of mentally handicapped people based there, But the people who could come to see me would come in from outside, wouldn't have any idea who they were coming in. In this instance, I was in the basement, and this guy came in, and I have to improvise with my. I know my system, so I have to improvise to give this guy a sense of something. I'm going to turn it up a bit because he couldn't get carers to work with him. The woman was his relative, and at 150 I marked. The thing to look for is her response to him getting so engaged with this. Just a second. So you hear the sound, I've mapped it to just a piano sound, but I changed it to a choir afterwards. He was a biter, he would bite his hands. So it was scary, it was really scary. Now I changed the sound from a piano. Piano wasn't really working. And this choir, you can see she's grabbing his hand, stopping him. I'll leave it run from here. You give positive affirmation on this. He's back into it, huh? It was magical. It was great. This one is from '96, and over in Atlanta, the guy on the right was my friend from Korea, the master musician I spoke about. He doesn't do anything, but this was originally recorded in NTSC, so it's not a very good recording. But it was in a 1,000-seat auditorium in downtown Atlanta, the Rialto Theatre. It's only a little short clip. But what's happening is the guy in the wheelchair, I wanted someone to come up and do a demonstration of my stuff. It was a 2-hour performance with mixed contact improvisation dance. I did some stuff and what have you, but this guy came up, I met him in the daytime. He came before the show started, had 5 minutes to understand the sensing spaces. I got 2 volumetric infrared sensors, one on each hand, away from his hand. He goes into them. They're mapped to C minor, a scale which means it's going to be okay. It's going to sound sort of okay. He's doing all the sounds he's doing. Now this guy's got cerebral palsy, and there's lots of spasming involved with cerebral palsy. And he spoke afterwards how it affected him. It lessened his feeling of the spasms. Composition, and there was silence, the control of silence, like I spoke earlier on. Very, very, very important for this work. And then I had a friend of mine, his name is Manu. We were at a party, both drunk, as sometimes you are. And Manu Photoshop, he was a painter with real painter. And he was really sad, depressed. He said, "Tony, Photoshop, you know, all these special effects, I'm devastated. I'm finished as a painter." I said, "No, you're not." I had an installation locally, and I had a big. I said, "Come on, we'll do an interactive painter." So we had a big canvas. I put sensors around it then. So as he would dip his paintbrush into the cans, and he would paint with the real paint, his movement was being tracked by the sensors, and then I was mapping that to either very slow sounds or very hard sounds. And it was really interesting because if it was a very slow sound, like a synth, his painting would go like this. And it was almost catch-22, as we say in English, whereby it was his movement that made the sound. But because I was controlling the sound, I was controlling his movement. Do you understand? I would change the synth patch to be like a Hendrix, and he would start going like this. It was really interesting as an interaction from that space. We did it 3 times, one Aarhus, one Copenhagen, one New York in the Gershwin. If anyone's been to the Gershwin, it's great. Okay, within my paper that I've written for this is something I'm really very interested in, and I talk quite a bit on it. It's digital empathy, and this is another video example. This is from around about 2000. I was the first resident artist for the Center for Advanced Visualization and Interactivity in Aarhus at the university. And I asked the local institute, can I have some guys to volunteer? They volunteered them. They couldn't speak. They were 4.5, 5 years of age. 4 guys. We went into the Holobench. We had active VR. This young guy, his name is Martin. He came in, he would not, and the other guy, he was first in, he would not let us put the active shutter glasses on because it was not one size fits all. It was size for an adult, for a young guy 5 years of age. If any of you know the old shutter glasses, it wasn't fitting him, so he shook his head. And you'll see now we didn't need the VR. Just driving in mono was fine. I'll start this because it isn't very long, but it's quite important to what I'm going to say. It was a European probe, it was, from I3. Martin is 5 years of age. He is dependent on his wheelchair. He can hear and has limited vision, but notices strong colors and follows images with his eyes. We are told that the sounds he makes are indicative of enjoyment in the current activity that he's involved in. This was the first time Martin tried to control the spacecraft. 2 sensors were set up so as to capture the gesture of head movement. Martin quickly recognized that he could affect the spacecraft and often interacts with vigorous side-to-side movements of his head, which results in corresponding movement from the image in front of him. So when we did the research, it was a week, different things, and he was controlling robotic lights and everything, total empowerment. Then he went back to the institute with his 3 friends. And they gave me permission to show it within my research. And then I thought, okay, this is really, really strong. I'd like to go back and ask them, can I have more, a wider permission to show it to lots of people. And I went back and asked them. They were very positive. But meanwhile, Martin had died. Now then, what I'm about to say is totally speculative. And I thought, what if I'd been given the best ever toy that I could be given? What if someone had come and taken that toy away, like we did at the end of that week, when he had that virtual reality toy? He was controlling a VR plane, a Star Wars fighter, whatever it was, and he didn't have any more access to that. He couldn't then express to his carers, to his parents, that, hey, what about my toy? Where's my toy gone? And I speak about this because I think that as a researcher within this field, all we thought about was that 1 week where we're going to get our data, and he's going to go back. He'll be happy, you know. He hasn't had an experience like that before. That will be good for him. We don't know if it was totally good for him or whether we did something that made him depressed because at the end of that he didn't have access to it. Do you understand where I'm going? So I think that there's a case to look at of digital empathy in such cases where what I try and do now, when I get a research project, I very much try to get enough funding to get a system for the place where we get the volunteers from. But that isn't enough, because what's involved with that over the years of work that I'm talking about, like I mentioned, I used to be the facilitator. There's a big weakness within this work where the facilitator, who I talked about was being technophobic, is very weak, and they're the person who's doing the intervention with the subject. So you need as well funds to train that person, because very often they're in a situation where they've got, their days are full, and to take them out of that situation into a training situation with some digital stuff. And it's easier perhaps nowadays because, like I said, their kids are doing this, or perhaps they're playing the games as well. But I think it's an important point to consider anyway, that to discuss anyway. So these were parts of the European projects that I was involved in on the turn of the century. And we worked also with physical feedback. So this was a vibroacoustic chamber. I don't know if you're aware of them. So this was me. She's 17 years of age. She's profoundly disabled. She's lying on a chamber where we're feeding the sound into the box underneath her body. So as she's moving, she's giving herself haptic feedback. And so you get the low frequencies. You've got a visual in front, so she's controlling the red, green, blue through the 3 sensors, and she's got 3 musical instruments simultaneously going, stimulating her through the audio side of things. So this was the end of the 90s, and yeah, like I said, I wanted to make the system, and what I thought was a friend of mine, came up, and he was a business guy, American guy, and he said, "Oh, we start a company, and it'll be very good." And this is where we went. We made games. We had some guys in to make games, interns, like I showed you earlier on, my students, and we made lots and lots of games. And people had seen me at some of these messes, and I'd been at this Center for Brain Injury in Copenhagen. I'd been at the Center for Brain Injury in Aarhus, and also some institutes. So. But it didn't work out. But I wanted to show you these games to give you some examples of. I explained the tray earlier on. The hand was, somebody would be in front of a sensor, and because one side of the body in brain injury is very often neglected, the dynamic of a movement is very important as well as the balance. But the dynamic of a movement would trigger then. You could adjust the threshold of that to allow that person to get the feedback of throwing the ball. The ball would be released from the hand. So again, looking at this, the data that's involved, and this was. I'll start this as well. This exemplifies the 3 sensor setup. This was a choir conductor, and the sensors were mapped then to RGB. So I'd created. An animation that could be painted with his hand movement going within these 3 sensing spaces. And what was interesting about this, why I wanted to show you this, because I'm hoping you can analogize from what I'm talking about data into games or whatever you're doing. In this situation, it was done for the television station, and because of that, it was 5-6 takes. And what was interesting at the start of the first take. His movements, I'll just use the one hand. It was his choir. He didn't really need to be there. They were going to sing okay anyway. Huh? So it was like this. But by the time we'd reached the 6th take, his movements were like this. And there was no other reason apart from that he was being stimulated through this neurofeedback loop that my friend talked about. And it was very, very interesting. So it was a big setup in the television studios and what have you. Exemplifying further, this was the robotic lights that actually physically move. They're like disco lights, and the young boys can move any part of the body, little heads, and you could scale it down through the software I was using, and then map it to the ways the lights would go around the room. Very empowering way of a physical movement feeding back to a physical input movement. We created a patent. I'm not really into patents. And then I got an invite to put my art into space. This is to make you smile, huh? So I did. I said agreed to it. There was 40 of us in the world, 40 artists. And I sent the image you saw earlier on of these guys painting through their body movement. And so it was etched onto a microchip and put out into space. So this image wasn't in the paper, and this is the Zoom. And in the paper I write about that. The reason I wrote about the Zoom was because this was a result of around about 2002, 2003, questioning this intervention where you have this moment of flow, you have the Csikszentmihalyi side of things, you have the micro development, which is Klaus Fischer's work, where you're questioning the scalloped learning that is his model is very interesting. You have the Schoen's work where you have the inaction, on-action side of things, the inaction changes, the on-action changes for the iterative design, and synthesizing those together evolved this model. And I'm really hoping people will look at this and come back to me, criticize it, take it on, improve it, because I think it's quite interesting in whatever the content you're working with is, whether it's the creative expression or whether it's games. Now, my subtitle for my paper says when games are not enough. And that was a little bit to provoke you a bit, in so much as I also get worried about people being in my environments and they get bored with either the creative expression or with the game. And by changing then to the total other genre of the creative expression or the game, and both of them would have been tailored for the person anyway, that's what this relates to, is that when you make a change within that environment to keep that person engaged beyond what's possible otherwise. This is painting through movement. Worked with a team from University of Genoa, the Eyes Web. This is for, somebody asked me about this, about balance training. This was a third-person study from 2003. It's up on PubMed. And what they saw, if you go down to the bottom there, is this little bit. Can you see my mouse? Yeah. And that's the computer games. So it was huge findings. And it's about this motivation and optimizing this motivation of somebody being engaged with the feedback that stimulates them to a point. And this was done after I left the company, but I was so happy to see it, because the game side of things, because you have the competition and what used to happen, I'll give you an instance. I hope I'm okay on time. The people used to come for the sessions. We'd have about 16 people coming for the sessions. It was over about a year. And what I did was I made a little chart. I had their names up here and how many fish they caught. Very simple. So they'd come in, and what would happen then is that people would come in, they take their coat off, it was by where they put their coats, and the first thing they would look at is how many their friend had. And they'd walk away and say, ah, damn, he's got 2 more than me. So this competitive side of games was so motivating that we didn't do anything. We just put how many fish they'd caught. And it was just fascinating to see how that worked. I'm nearly finished now. With the MIDI side of things I mentioned, there's new stuff happening. There's a new extra expressive potentials within it. It's called multidimensional polyphonic expression. New instruments are being made. Very, very, very interesting. I'm going to go past that. And this is an example of a game, which is fibromyalgia. This was just a simple use in a commercial game. Fibromyalgia is the pain that's in the body, where it's so hard to diagnose and treat. This was after this was session number 2, and in a moment it changes to session number 10. Now you're looking at the dynamics of movement. The change from this, you'll see her dress will change. Huh? You know the game, huh? So it's, if you're old enough. And this change in dynamic movement was so positive. See the range of movement, the dynamics of going for it, and then at the end, such a big, big smile. It's crazy, yeah? And that wasn't many sessions. Okay. I go past that. This is the game I spoke to you about with the dolphin, the dead fish flying down. And this was some of the work in the brain injury with that game. And what happened is, because we were working with the sensor side of things, the woman in white is the physiotherapist. Now, when you've got the dolphin, the wire mesh model of the dolphin, you've got 2 dynamics to movement. You've got the horizontal, you've got the vertical. So one sensor is mapped to the horizontal, one's mapped to the vertical. She's controlling, it looks like the vertical, and the patient on the left, he's controlling the horizontal. But the task is heading towards him doing both together. And it's not as easy because you can stray outside of the sensing space. And here you see him doing them both together. It's a bit like when you do this. So it's a little bit tough. But it was so positively received. You can see him here controlling it. Lots of laughter. So as well as the games you make, I think it's how you get people to use your games, the environments around, the thinking of them using the game. And this was in hospitals. I just wanted to, if I have to, am I okay in time? Yeah, just want to show you this one. You probably know this game, but this is the videos. In this work, it's just magical seeing how you can affect someone. This little girl, she's playing this keep up game. It's a different girl, you can see. I think it was her sister. And the little one is just, she's jumping out of this. And we never told the doctors, because we didn't run it, the doctors ran it. And in Sweden, it was the play therapists. But they were so engaged with this game, so motivated through their bodies to keep this ball in the air. And you see the doctor laughing. Yeah, okay. I can talk about that afterwards if someone's interested. That's the end. So thank you. Sorry.
Thank you, Tony. This was fantastic. Do we have any questions from the audience?
Many thanks, Tony. I think that I have, I don't know, 1,000 questions. It's been super enriching and magnificent. You were talking about tons of things and all of them super interesting. I wanted to ask about the fibromyalgia experiment. So what happened there exactly? That this woman, she was like playing and playing again and playing again and playing again. And after 10 sessions that she had been playing, you know, she would completely change the way she would interact, she would move because she was like in the mood, because she was like flowing. Because, I mean, was it like that? Because I understand that she was having all the pain, so maybe she didn't move at the beginning. So if you could explain a little bit more.
Great. Thank you. The fibromyalgia, I'm not an expert on it. So what happened, we worked with a Norwegian doctor who's a specialist in it. And in Denmark, one of the reasons I'm in Denmark is because the welfare system is very, very good there. There's lots of support for the people. And each, let's say, disease has got a union almost that supports them in the latest state-of-the-art, how to get money. But fibromyalgia is such a complex thing. It usually hits, as I understand it, more so women than men, more so in the working age, and it's very complex. One day you can be fine, next day you can be bedridden. So how we set up this was that we actually did 2 studies. This was from the first study where we only used the Wii. Later we used the Wii, the Move, and the Kinect. But this was the first study. And what was really interesting, I wrote very interesting, I think it's an interesting paper, between the 2 studies, because the first study here was led by a PhD student I had who was a game guy, okay? For the second study, it was led by 2 physiotherapists. And the physiotherapists had a framework that they worked in that was rule-based from the physiotherapy perspective. And the results weren't the same as this. The guy from the games world led it, really nice guy from Iceland, Gudmundur, and he just wanted them to play the game. So you understand where I'm going with this, because it's very important for people to play the game and not think about, am I doing the right movement? Whereas with the physiotherapist leading it, they went through all these tests to start, to test them afterwards as well. But they were so in a framework that they had to do towards the right movement. And it was different results. So it's very important, that side of things. So he led, we put the cameras up in the section of the lab. I wasn't down there, so Gudmundur run it. And then we just decided not to do the first session, because actually first session is about the learning of this, the control. And then we did the last session. So yes, they'd learned more about the control, but they picked a game that they wanted to express. Another woman I have is bowling. Equally as much, I don't have time to show you now, but equally dynamic change, amazing change. And then the evaluation of it came from the doctor because he had his test to go back into, and then the union also came across and they evaluated from their perspective all the video footage we had and the data that he had. So it was a very simple study using a commercial, controller, a commercial game. We didn't hack it or nothing. It was just as it comes, with the thought of them using it at home towards improving their lessening their movement. And the results were like that. What happened was we didn't have, I think we started with about 30 people, his patients, and he profiled them. And then in the end, I think we had 4 who stuck with the 10 sessions. They wouldn't come back one day, or there's always an excuse. Another story that went with it, which was also interesting, was that one of them would come up with her children, and she would come up in her day-to-day clothes, and then she would change into a lycra. She bought herself a lycra suit. This was going to be her exercise, her stuff to do. And the children were there supporting her. Another woman came up to do it, and she would come up and say, "This is my space." She wanted that privacy to express herself. And all of these things are really, really interesting because you can see it in different instances, not just that study, but I've seen in different instances. So then, I talk a lot on this, but so I would do a workshop making a private space and then a public space to see was that also within that situation. And then it's really interesting. So that study was that the dynamics were such a change, and you could see it. The doctor wrote a paper on it, and so I don't know if it was much that the 400% in that paper I put up here just now, but it was pretty close if you did the data on, I think. Does that answer your question roughly? So my thanks for the question.